I will never forget the moment my phone lit up after that quiet family dinner. The dishes still warm in the sink, the house smelling like cinnamon and baked apples, when a message from my own child landed like a stone in my chest and said, "I know you hid $7 million from me and my wife. Give it to us. Or else." And for a long breath, I just sat at the kitchen table with my hands around a mug that had already gone cold, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rain pushing against the windows, the way it always does here in Seattle, thinking about the cost of silence, the price of love, and how the people you raise can one day speak to you in a voice you do not recognize at all. And before I carry you through what happened next, I should tell you who I am and how old I am, so you can see me clearly in your mind. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 62 years old. I wish I could tell you there were warning signs bright as a neon billboard, that I missed some big, obvious clue, that I ignored a chorus of red flags snapping in the wind. But the truth is quieter and trickier than that because it hides inside little moments and easy smiles and polite phrases where everyone keeps their hands clean and their eyes soft. And even tonight, when my son Michael and his wife Vanessa sat at my table with my sweet granddaughter Chloe and ate roast chicken and green beans and laughed at a story about Chloe's school play, I thought to myself how much it means when people share their thoughts and show support. So don't forget to leave a comment and a like if this story touches you. Even then, there was something off about the way Michael asked me how the week had gone and whether I had finally sorted that bank thing. And Vanessa made an offhand remark about neighborhoods where people keep their lawns too perfect so they can impress strangers, a remark that sounded like nothing and everything all at once, and I remember I reached for the salt, and my hand shook for a second. Not because I was afraid, but because somewhere deep in me a small voice nudged me and said, "Pay attention. This is the sound a door makes right before it closes." Yesterday afternoon, while the light was thin and the sky had that silver color it gets before evening, I took a cab to an office tucked behind a line of maple trees, and I sat with a man named Richard Hall, a steady friend who has known my family for more than 20 years, and we signed papers that turned numbers on a screen into something with roots and purpose, the kind of thing my husband Alan would have called real work, because it touched lives and did not just sit in an account growing dust. And we talked about scholarships and a small wing for a community center and grants for seniors who needed help with home repairs. Simple things that keep dignity intact. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was using what I had in a way that honored the years we fought for stability, the years when Alan worked late and I balanced books and packed leftovers in careful containers, and while all of that was fresh in my mind, Michael's message arrived as if the universe wanted to test the shape of my spine. I did not answer him right away, because I learned a long time ago that a fast reply can feed a fire, and I sat there with my phone face down on the table while the rain gathered into a steady curtain outside, and the house creaked the way old houses do when they settle into night, and I let myself trace the map of memory back to the first time I ever took a risk bigger than my pay grade, back to a decade when people were shaking their heads and clutching their pearls and predicting doom whenever anyone said the word investment. Yet I put a modest sum into a fund run by a woman who reminded me of my younger self, the kind of woman who still believes spreadsheets tell the truth if you are brave enough to read them without fear. And I remember standing in our narrow kitchen telling Alan that I wanted to try this because it was not about getting rich. It was about putting one brick down after another to build a small, safe place for later. And he kissed the top of my head and said, "Do it, Evie, because I know you. You are careful enough to make a bold choice without losing your balance. and those words have lived under my ribs ever since. The dinner itself had been pleasant on the surface, the kind of evening where you pass the bread and ask about traffic and pretend not to notice the little edges that catch on conversation. And Vanessa wore a soft gray sweater and smiled at Chloe when she talked about her science project, and Michael told a story about a client who wanted a rooftop deck with a view of the water, even though his house did not have the bones for it. A story I would have found funny if I had not been busy watching the way his eyes slid toward my purse when I stood to refill glasses. And when they left, he hugged me too tightly, like a person testing the weight of fabric to see if it is lined with something valuable. And he said, "Drive safe, Mom," as if he had driven anywhere at all. And then the door shut, and I stood in the hallway with my hand on the frame and felt that same small voice again, the one that has kept me safe more than once, whispering that love can be real and still be mistaken for permission by those who prefer shortcuts. When I finally turned my phone over and read his message again, I noticed the rhythm of it, the way it used my own habits against me, because I am a tidy person with tidy records, and that means anyone who wants to peek into my life can find neat folders and clear dates and careful labels, and I knew right then that this did not come from nowhere, that someone had talked to someone, that a casual question had been asked with a smile, and that an answer had been offered with the shrug people use when they want to seem innocent. And I thought about Vanessa and her circle of friends who love charity galas more than they love charity, and about how, last week, she had mentioned a friend who works at a bank and knows how to untangle things. And I decided the only way to keep my balance was to sit very still and let the first wave roll over me without flinching, because panic is a poor accountant and fear makes foolish math. I stood up, washed my mug, wiped the counter the way I always do. Straight lines and small circles, a little ritual that resets my day. Then I went to my study and opened the bottom drawer, where I keep a leather folder with a pen that writes like silk. And I read through the documents Richard and I had signed, the trust language, simple and clean, the beneficiaries clear, the timeline firm, the governance board names already penciled in, and seeing it all there in black and white steadied me because it reminded me that generosity is not the same as weakness, and that helping others does not require asking for permission from people who only show up when there is a check involved. And I told myself what I have told many clients over years of balancing other people's books, that paper tells a story, and if you let it, it will hold you upright when voices try to bend you. I know some of you will ask why 7 million. How does a woman like me, who grew up in a rented house with a stubborn father and a mother who stretched soup with potatoes, end up with a number like that attached to her name? And I will tell you that nothing about it was magic, that it was dull choices repeated many times, that it was saying no when yes would have been more fun, that it was taking a small risk at the right time and letting it sit quietly while the world shouted about quicker ways to the same place. And it was also a windfall I did not expect when a company I had shares in changed hands at just the right moment. And all I could think, when Richard called to confirm the final numbers, was how much Alan would have smiled if he had made it to this day, because he used to say that security is not a thing you buy. It is a set of decisions you repeat until your nerves calm down. And in his memory, I chose to direct the largest piece toward work that lifts people up without taking their names and turning them into trophies for social media. Chloe had texted me earlier in the evening a photo of the dessert she helped me decorate, a little apple tart with a messy swirl of caramel that she declared perfect because it looked like a galaxy. And seeing her name on my screen now made my throat sting because I knew that there would be a moment, not tonight, but soon, when she would stand in the middle of something heavy and feel torn between love and loyalty and the voices in her own house, and I promised myself I would make it easy for her, that my choices would not force a child to carry adult weight, and that promise became another kind of backbone, a quiet steel that kept me from writing back anything sharp, anything I would regret, anything that could be twisted into a story where I was the one losing my grip. I typed a single sentence to Michael, a sentence that was both true and plain, and said we can talk tomorrow, and then I put the phone down again because I did not want to be pulled into a midnight exchange where words would fly like arrows and nothing good would come of it. And I stood by the window and watched a car move slowly under the streetlight, and the rain made a soft halo around the hood, and for a second I saw Alan's old truck in that glow, the one with the dent from our first camping trip, and I heard his laugh in my head, that warm sound that always made me braver, and I whispered to the empty room that I was going to do this my way, with patience and careful steps, and a plan that leaves no loose edges for people to tug on. I slept lightly and woke before dawn, the house still and the sky the color of slate, and I made coffee and stood on the back porch in my sweater, feeling the wet air kiss my face. And I thought about the word hidden and how it can mean something sneaky or something sacred depending on who says it. And in my case, it meant private. It meant personal. It meant I had a right to arrange my own future and to decide how to honor the past without turning it into currency for someone else's lifestyle. And I told myself that whatever happened today, I would not apologize for seeking to do good with what I had, and I would not let anyone talk to me like a clerk at a window handing over a file to the next person in line. When the city finally woke and the light came up over the water, I called Richard and told him about the message, and he listened, the way good friends do, without interrupting. And he said, "We will keep our steps clean and our documents cleaner, and we will not feed any stories that do not serve you. And if a conversation must happen, we will invite it into a room where the walls are made of facts." And then he reminded me gently that I had always been the careful one, that my calm under pressure was not an act, and he asked if I wanted him to be present when I met with Michael, and I said yes, not because I felt fragile, but because love can tangle truth, and a third pair of eyes keeps the knots from tightening. Before that meeting could happen, though, the day had its own small tests, because people who want something quickly do not like to wait. And by mid-morning, Vanessa had sent a message dressed up as concern that asked if I was feeling well and if I needed help managing anything complicated, a message with too many hearts and too few real words, and I let it sit. And then a mutual acquaintance left a voicemail saying they had heard I was making big decisions and to call them if I needed a referral to a more aggressive team, a phrase that told me everything I needed to know about where the whispers had been traveling. And I smiled to myself because I have seen this dance before, the way people circle when they think they smell opportunity. And I reminded myself that generosity done right is not a show. It is a contract with your own values. And that contract does not require applause or permission slips. I met Chloe after school for a hot chocolate at a small place near the library, a cozy room with chalkboard menus, and a jar of lemon cookies that reminded me of my mother's kitchen. And she leaned across the table, the way teenagers do when they have a big thought and a small window to share it. And she said, "Grandma, I think Mom and Dad are tense about money again." And I said that happens sometimes in grown-up worlds. And she said, "I know, but it feels like a storm." And I tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and told her that storms pass, and that she does not have to stand outside without a coat. And I meant every word, because I would build 100 roofs before I let that child get soaked on my account. When I finally dialed Michael that afternoon and told him we could sit down early evening at my house and talk about whatever he wanted to put on the table, he agreed too fast, the way a person says yes when they believe the prize is already in the room. And after I ended the call, I walked through the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs and the edges of picture frames, letting each small familiar thing remind me that I am allowed to feel safe in my own space. And then I gathered the papers I wanted in one folder and put a small notepad and a pen beside it, and I lit a candle that smells like cedar because it calms me. And I sat for a moment and breathed, long and steady, like the women in my family taught me when life asks a question you are not obliged to answer with fear. The knock came exactly on time, the kind of precision that would have made me proud when he was 12 and remembering his chores. And when I opened the door, Michael stood with his shoulders squared, and Vanessa a half step behind him, her smile polite and her eyes bright with the kind of shine that comes from a story people tell themselves all day long until it feels like a fact. And I stepped aside and said, "Come in," and they did. And as the door closed, I felt it again, the quiet strength that comes when you know who you are and what you have done. And I realized that no matter how loud this conversation got, there was a truth under it, like bedrock, and it belonged to me. We sat at the table where the apple tart had been just the night before, and I poured water because my mother always said, "Start with water. It slows people down." And Michael cleared his throat and began with words that sounded rehearsed about family transparency and shared responsibilities, and how certain numbers had come to his attention. And while he spoke, I watched the way his fingers tapped a rhythm on the wood, and how he would not quite meet my eyes. And when he finished, I waited a beat longer than comfortable, because space is a tool if you know how to use it. And then I said in a voice, as even as the line on a ledger, that I was happy to discuss anything, but we would keep this conversation respectful, and we would stick to facts, and we would not say things we cannot take back. And I watched the shape of the room change a little at that, as if the furniture itself had decided to sit up straight. I will tell you exactly what I said next, and exactly how the air felt when I said it, but that belongs to the turning of the key, the moment the story steps from suspicion into daylight. And to do it justice, I have to lay down every piece of the path that brought us to that chair and those glasses of water and that folder waiting by my hand, because when a mother answers her child's demand for what he thinks is his by right, the echo of that answer shapes not only the day but the years that follow. And I wanted to make sure that when I finally opened my mouth, I spoke from the truest part of me, the part that remembers every night shift, every coupon, every time I kept a promise to myself in a world that kept asking me to break it. That night, after Michael and Vanessa left, when the laughter had already faded into the damp Seattle air, and Chloe's cheerful little wave was the last honest moment I carried from the evening, I locked the door, turned off the porch light, and thought the house had finally exhaled into peace. But then the vibration of my phone on the counter cut through the silence like a sharp blade, and I saw Michael's name glowing on the screen with a message that made my heart squeeze so tightly I could barely breathe. The words simple and brutal, written without hesitation, as if love had been packed away and replaced by greed. "I know you hid $7 million from me and Vanessa. Give it to us, or else." For a moment, I could not even move. I just stared at the letters, my hands trembling slightly, as though the ground itself had shifted under my feet, and I thought about how surreal it felt to be threatened by the very person I once held against my chest, the little boy with skinned knees who used to cry when thunder rattled the windows, now sending me a demand that made me feel like I was nothing more than a bank account to him. I sank into the chair by the window, phone still in my hand, and outside the rain grew heavier, running down the glass in crooked trails, and I whispered his name softly to myself as though saying it out loud would summon back the child I raised, the boy who once asked me to stay in his room until he fell asleep. And yet the man who wrote those words was not the same boy, not even close. He was someone shaped by Vanessa's sharp edges and endless hunger for more, someone who measured worth in square footage and designer logos, someone who forgot that money can buy comfort but never love, and the sting of that realization spread through me like cold water. I wanted to call him right back, to ask how he could even write something so cruel, but instead I closed my eyes and let the silence grow because I knew an immediate reaction would give him exactly what he wanted, proof that he had shaken me. As I sat there, the memories came rushing in, little fragments of my life with him and with Alan, my late husband, who would have known exactly what to say, who would have stood behind me with steady hands on my shoulders, reminding me that storms can be weathered if you stand tall. And I remembered the promises Alan and I had made to one another late at night at our kitchen table decades ago, promising that we would build a future with patience and with care, that we would never let money change the way we looked at each other or at our family. And yet here I was, holding a phone that carried proof that one of us had broken that promise. Not Alan, not me, but the very child we raised together. I walked into the study, opened the folder again just to steady myself, running my fingers over the clean lines of the trust papers, each word a safeguard against the very storm I now found myself in. And I reminded myself that this message did not come from nowhere, that it was the result of whispers and suspicions that had probably been growing in their house for months, maybe years, fed by Vanessa's ambition and Michael's weakness. And though my heart ached, I also felt something stronger stir inside me, a mix of hurt and steel, because if they thought I would hand over my future, my husband's memory, and my hard-won security just because they typed a threat into a screen, then they had underestimated not only my resolve but also my ability to fight with quiet precision. I pressed the phone face down on the table, lit the cedar candle again, and whispered into the stillness that I was not going to let fear write my story, because this was only the beginning, and if Michael thought that a single message would break me, he was about to discover that his mother had more strength and more secrets than he ever imagined. The message from Michael still burned at the back of my mind like a neon sign I could not turn off. But as the night stretched into the early hours, and I sat curled in the armchair with only the soft glow of the lamp keeping me company, I found myself drifting backward through time, because the truth was that those $7 million did not appear in my life like magic. They were not some buried treasure or a lottery ticket. They were the result of decades of choices, small and careful, often thankless, and sometimes even mocked. And if my son had truly understood where they came from and what they meant, he might have thought twice before reducing them to something he could demand with a single text. I was in my late 30s when the first seed was planted, working long hours as a bookkeeper at a mid-sized company downtown, carrying stacks of ledgers heavier than they looked, back when everything was still on paper, and mistakes were erased with pink dust that clung to your fingers. And one afternoon a colleague mentioned a new investment fund, led by a woman who was making quiet waves in the financial world, a woman who believed that patient growth would always outlast flashy risks. And something in me, something that had always been steady but curious, decided to listen. Alan and I were not wealthy people. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on the north side of the city with a mortgage that felt like a second shadow, and we stretched every dollar the way my mother once stretched broth. But Alan believed in me with the kind of faith that is stronger than any market trend. And when I told him about this fund, about how I wanted to take a small sum from our savings and see where it could go, he didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes the way some men might. Instead, he leaned across the kitchen table late at night when Chloe's father, Michael, was still just a boy asleep in his bed, and he kissed my hand and said, "Evie, you have the kind of mind that knows when numbers are telling the truth. So if you feel it, do it." That moment has lived with me like a compass. Because I trusted myself enough to step forward, and I trusted Alan enough to let his faith carry me. The years rolled on, sometimes quietly, sometimes with storms. But that little investment grew, slowly at first, and then steadily. And as time passed, I added more when I could, just as I kept working extra hours, saying no to vacations we couldn't afford, patching the same sofa cushion 3 times before finally replacing it. And every small sacrifice became a brick in a wall that would later hold me up when everything else seemed unsteady. When Alan passed away far too soon, the grief was so heavy I thought it might drown me. But even in that loss, I remembered how he always said that stability is a gift you give yourself, so no one else can take it away. And when the fund matured into something much larger than I ever expected, when the payout arrived with numbers that made even my cautious heart skip a beat, I knew immediately that this was not just money. It was years of discipline, years of belief, years of love pressed into figures on a page. That is why, just yesterday, I signed the documents that would turn those figures into something that breathed, into scholarships for students who reminded me of the young woman I once was, into programs for veterans who carried burdens most people could not see, into support for seniors who had worked their whole lives only to find themselves struggling with things as simple as keeping their roofs from leaking. And as I watched the ink dry, I felt Alan's presence in the room as if he were smiling at me, proud that I had chosen to honor our life together, not with empty shows of wealth, but with quiet, steady generosity. And yet, less than 24 hours later, my son had the audacity to reduce all of that into a demand, as if he were entitled to erase the years of sacrifice and turn them into cash for himself and Vanessa. And the weight of that betrayal pressed against my chest until I felt I could barely breathe. Still, as the sky outside began to pale with the first hint of dawn, I realized that no matter how painful his message was, it also clarified something I had been avoiding for too long. Because those $7 million were not simply hidden, they were protected, shielded, not only for my own peace of mind, but for the greater good. They were meant to serve, and if Michael wanted to turn love into leverage, then he would soon learn that his mother had built her future on stronger foundations than greed could ever shake. The morning after that sleepless night had a heaviness to it, the kind of heaviness that lingers in the air after a storm, but before the sun decides whether it will break through, and I tried to settle myself into the rhythm of ordinary tasks, brewing coffee, slicing fruit, tidying the papers in my study, convincing myself that normalcy could hold back the tide of what I knew was coming. But by mid-afternoon, I heard the sound of tires crunching over the wet gravel outside, and when I looked through the lace curtains, I saw Michael's car parked too close to the walkway, the engine still running as though they had no intention of staying long. But I knew better. I knew that kind of posture, the kind that says we are here to claim something, and my heart sank, even before the knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps that carried no warmth, only urgency. I opened it to find Michael standing with his shoulders stiff and Vanessa a half-step behind him, her arms crossed over her chest, her perfume too strong for the small porch, her eyes scanning the hallway behind me like she was already measuring what might someday be hers. And though her lips curved into a polite smile, her voice betrayed the impatience beneath it when she said, "We thought we'd stop by since you didn't answer Michael's message last night." I stepped aside, more out of habit than invitation, and watched them enter my living room like guests who had long ago forgotten their manners. Vanessa immediately lowering herself onto the sofa with the air of a woman inspecting fabric, Michael pacing near the mantelpiece as though the photographs of his childhood no longer meant anything more than decorations. At first their words wore the costume of concern, Michael asking if I was doing all right, if I was sure I wasn't overwhelmed by all the complicated things I had been handling. Vanessa chiming in that it must be stressful to manage so much at my age, and though the words might have sounded caring to an outsider, the tone was sharp enough to slice through the pretense, each syllable dripping with accusation disguised as sympathy. And when I said calmly that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, Michael's expression tightened, as though he had expected me to fold easily. Then came the shift, small but unmistakable, the way predators circle before showing their teeth, and Michael cleared his throat and said, "Maybe it's time we talk openly about what's been going on with your accounts, Mom, because Vanessa and I know about the 7 million. And it doesn't make sense for you to keep that hidden when it could be used to help the family." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking, and I saw Vanessa's lips curl into a satisfied smirk, as if this confrontation were a performance she had been directing all along. And I realized then that they had not come seeking understanding or conversation. They had come to stake a claim, to treat me as though I were merely the gatekeeper of a fortune they believed already belonged to them. I wanted to shout, to tell them how many years of sacrifice and quiet choices stood behind that number. But instead I folded my hands in my lap, drew in a steady breath, scented faintly of the cedar candle I had lit earlier, and I said with deliberate calm that my finances were not up for negotiation, and that the conversation would end if they continued to speak to me with entitlement rather than respect. Michael's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief, like a boy denied a toy he thought was already his, and Vanessa leaned forward, her voice low and sharp, saying things about responsibility and family duty, implying that I was selfish, that I was clinging to resources better managed by younger hands. But beneath her practiced tone, I heard the desperation of someone who saw her carefully constructed lifestyle slipping through her fingers, and in that moment I understood that this was not about love, not about care, not even about Michael entirely. It was about Vanessa's hunger for control. When they finally left, after an hour of circling the same accusations, their words lingering like a bitter taste, I closed the door behind them and pressed my back against it, the quiet of the house rushing in around me like a balm, and though my chest ached from the weight of their betrayal, I also felt a steady flame beginning to burn inside me, because their visit had confirmed what I already suspected, that they would not stop until they had either broken me or been forced to face the truth, and I had no intention of being broken. The days that followed their sudden visit felt heavy with a strange tension, as though the walls of my house were listening with me, waiting for the next knock, and though Michael tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy with short phone calls about Chloe's school projects or traffic on the bridge, I could feel Vanessa's hand behind every word, pulling strings, writing the script, feeding him the lines he should deliver. I have known that woman long enough to recognize her fingerprints on everything. The polished phrases about responsibility, the dramatic sighs about family obligations, the way she slipped poison into sentences and then smiled sweetly as though she had just offered a compliment. And I realized with a sick clarity that she was not going to rest until she had twisted Michael into believing that betraying his own mother was not only acceptable, but necessary. Neighbors talk, friends talk, and even people who think they are being discreet leave trails, and soon enough, pieces of their plan began to reach me in whispers and offhand remarks. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing Michael and Vanessa downtown near a law office, walking quickly, Vanessa carrying a leather folder as though it were treasure, Michael looking pale and nervous like a boy about to cheat on a test. Another friend told me they had heard Vanessa asking questions at a luncheon about legal guardianship for elderly parents, framing it as helping someone else, but asking with a little too much interest, and I knew immediately what that meant, because I had balanced enough estate ledgers in my career to know the language of power grabs, and it chilled me to think that my own son's wife was building a case to strip me of the right to control my own life. In my mind, I could see the conversations they must have had at night. After Chloe went to bed, Vanessa sitting with her glass of wine, her voice low and persuasive, telling Michael that I was tired, that I was making reckless choices, that the money was slipping away from his rightful inheritance, and Michael, eager to prove himself strong, eager to keep the peace in his marriage, nodding along until he believed it was his idea. It pained me more than I can say to imagine it, to picture my son agreeing to reduce me to a signature on a document, to let strangers in suits declare me incapable just so he could soothe his wife's ambitions. But I knew Vanessa well enough to understand that once she fixed her eyes on a prize, she would not stop clawing toward it. And so I began to prepare quietly, not with panic but with purpose, calling Richard to review the papers again, asking him to explain every angle of protection, every clause that could withstand a challenge, and he reassured me with his calm, steady voice that the trust was ironclad, that my independence was well documented, that if Vanessa tried to drag me into court to prove otherwise, the evidence of my clarity would dismantle her case before it even began. Still, I could not ignore the ache in my chest, the sorrow that it had come to this, that my own son's household was plotting legal warfare against me, and I told myself again and again that this was not just about money, this was about dignity, and I would not let anyone strip me of that, not even the people who should have been my greatest comfort in these years of my life. Late one evening, as the rain tapped against the windows and the house smelled faintly of the lavender candle I had lit in the kitchen, I thought of Alan, of the promises we had whispered to one another when Michael was still a boy, that family would always come before anything else, and I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than ever. But even in that moment, when grief pressed down like a stone, I also felt a fierce resolve rising inside me, because if Vanessa thought she could manipulate my son and use the courts to cage me, she was about to learn that I had not built my life on fear or weakness. I had built it on discipline, patience, and the kind of quiet strength that no amount of scheming could undo. The loneliness of that week pressed on me like a heavy coat, the kind you cannot take off no matter how warm the room becomes, and though friends and neighbors passed by with their casual greetings and cheerful waves, none of them could see the storm gathering behind my windows. the quiet war being prepared by my own blood against me. I spent my mornings going through the motions, watering the plants on the porch, sweeping the kitchen floor, arranging the books in my study, but each action felt like a small ritual to steady myself, to remind me that I still controlled my space, my time, my choices. Still, no matter how carefully I kept to these routines, the silence of the house felt louder than usual, every creak of the floorboards sounding like an echo of betrayal. It was during one of those mornings that I drove downtown to Richard Hall's office, the rain streaking across my windshield in thin gray lines, the city traffic sluggish, as though the world itself wanted me to sit longer with my thoughts. Richard's office was tucked into the corner of a brick building that had stood for nearly a century, and stepping inside always felt like entering a place of steadiness, the shelves lined with law books, the air faintly smelling of leather and old wood, the kind of space where chaos seemed to pause at the door. Richard greeted me with that same calm strength he had shown me since Alan first introduced us decades ago, his handshake firm, his eyes steady. And as we sat across from each other at the polished oak desk, I felt a little of the weight lift from my chest. We went through every document again, every clause of the trust, every safeguard written into the papers, and Richard explained with the patience of a teacher that no court would strip me of my independence when my records were so clear, my mind so present, my intentions so well documented. He reminded me that I had taken every careful step, that Vanessa's whispers and Michael's weakness could not undo the foundation we had built, and he promised me that if they tried to drag this into the open, he would stand beside me without hesitation. Hearing those words steadied me, but I still felt the sting of knowing that this battle was not with strangers, not with rivals, but with the people who should have been my safe harbor. That evening, as I sat with a cup of tea cooling in my hands, Chloe came by after her choir practice, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair damp from the mist outside, and she collapsed onto the sofa with the unfiltered honesty only a 15-year-old can carry. She looked at me with eyes too wise for her age and said, "Grandma, why does Mom keep talking about money every time Dad gets quiet?" Her words hit me like an arrow, not because of the question itself, but because of the tremor in her voice, the way she twisted the strap of her backpack in her hands as though she feared even saying it aloud. I told her gently that sometimes adults forget what really matters, that sometimes fear and greed sound louder than love, and I promised her that none of this was her fault. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for a moment I felt the warmth of true family, the kind that cannot be bought or demanded, the kind that simply exists in the bond between two souls who choose to stand by each other. In that quiet, I realized that Chloe was my anchor, that she saw through the performance her parents staged, that she carried the honesty her father had long since misplaced. I held her hand and whispered that storms come and storms go, but the people who love you for who you are, not for what you have, will always remain. And though she did not answer, the way she squeezed my hand back told me she understood, more than I wished she had to. When she left that night, with her sneakers squeaking softly on the wet pavement, I stood by the window, watching her small frame disappear into the mist, and I promised myself out loud that I would not let Vanessa and Michael's greed poison Chloe's world, that I would protect her future, even if it meant breaking the fragile illusion of family once and for all. And in that promise, I felt my loneliness transform into something sharper, steadier, the kind of strength that does not roar but does not bend either, and I knew that the next time they tried to push me, I would be ready. The day they dragged me into the courthouse dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that presses low over the city like a warning, and as I walked up the stone steps with Richard beside me, I felt the chill of betrayal sharper than the drizzle that clung to my coat. I never imagined that my own son would stand on the other side of a courtroom from me. Never thought I would be forced to defend not only my money, but my very mind against the people who should have protected me. The building smelled of old paper and disinfectant, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, and as we entered the chamber I saw Michael seated stiffly at the table across the aisle, his suit too crisp, his expression tight, while Vanessa leaned toward him with her whispering mouth, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who thought victory was already hers. I took my seat quietly, folding my hands on the polished wood before me, while Richard spread out the neatly organized documents with the calm assurance of a man who had built his life on precision. Across the aisle sat their lawyer, a woman named Sandra Miller, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, tapping her pen with the rhythm of a person rehearsing their lines, and when Judge Helen Brooks entered, the room shifted into order, her presence commanding, her gaze sweeping the chamber with a clarity that left no corner in shadow. The proceedings began, and almost immediately Sandra launched into her speech, her voice smooth but cutting, painting me as a woman overwhelmed by age and confusion, a widow lost in complicated numbers, unable to make sound decisions, a woman who might squander millions through poor judgment if her loving family did not step in to protect her. I listened without flinching, though every word landed like a needle in my skin, because beneath the polished argument I could hear Vanessa's voice, her phrasing, her rehearsed lines dressed up in legal language. She had fed Sandra the story piece by piece, twisting my independence into weakness, my privacy into secrecy, my generosity into recklessness. Michael sat beside her, staring at the table, his jaw tight, his shoulders tense, and for one aching moment I thought I saw the boy he used to be, trapped in the man Vanessa had molded. But then he nodded at one of Sandra's points, and the hope slipped away like smoke. When it was Richard's turn, he rose with a steadiness that filled the room, his voice calm, clear, and deliberate. He began not with defenses but with facts, presenting medical evaluations that confirm my sharpness of mind, signed statements from colleagues who attested to my years of precise bookkeeping, bank records showing orderly transactions, and finally the trust documents themselves, sealed, notarized, and undeniable. He spoke with the rhythm of truth, each sentence building on the last, weaving a net that left no gaps for doubt, and as he laid the final document on the judge's bench, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of certainty. Judge Brooks leaned back in her chair, her hands folded as she considered both sides, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the firmness of stone. She said there was no evidence to support the claim that I was incapable, that the petition to transfer control of my finances was unfounded, and that the court would not be used as a tool for greed, disguised as concern. Her gaze flicked toward Michael and Vanessa with a sharpness that made them both shift uncomfortably, and for the first time since this battle began, I felt air fill my lungs like freedom. As the gavel came down with a sharp crack, Vanessa's confident smile faltered, her eyes darting to Michael as if to say this was not how the script was supposed to end, and Michael, for all his bluster, looked like a boy caught cheating on a test, his shoulders slumped, his eyes refusing to meet mine. I gathered my papers calmly, thanked Richard quietly, and walked out of that courtroom with my head high, not because the fight was over, but because I had faced their attempt to strip me of my dignity, and walked away intact, stronger than before, carrying with me the knowledge that truth, once spoken aloud in the light, cannot be undone by whispers in the dark. When the echo of the gavel still lingered in my ears and the courthouse air clung to me like dust, I thought the storm had quieted for a while, that the next battle would come in whispers behind closed doors. But fate had something else planned, because within days the story I had tried so carefully to keep private spilled into the world in a way that neither Michael nor Vanessa could have controlled. It began with a short piece in the local paper, tucked neatly in the community section, a small article written by a journalist who had once interviewed me years ago about bookkeeping, and who now, curious about the trust documents made public in court, dug deeper and found the registration of the charitable foundation I had signed into life only days earlier. By the following morning, the little article had grown wings, spreading from one outlet to another, until my name, Evelyn Carter, was suddenly being spoken not in hushed family accusations, but in headlines, praising generosity and vision. The phone began to ring non-stop, first with calls from the community center thanking me for the pledge that would repair their broken roof, then from a college administrator who had been quietly told about scholarships being prepared in Alan's memory, and then from people I had never met, neighbors, strangers, even old co-workers, leaving messages full of gratitude, voices quivering with emotion as they thanked me for what they called a gift to the city. At first I wanted to hide, to let the noise pass, but as I sat with Richard reviewing the avalanche of calls and letters, I realized this was bigger than me. This was Alan's legacy glowing brighter than I had ever imagined, and though I had meant it to be a quiet act, the world had decided to hold it up as a lantern. Meanwhile, Michael and Vanessa's narrative began to unravel like thread pulled too quickly from a frayed sweater. Where they had tried to paint me as frail and confused, the public now saw a woman deliberate and clear, someone who had chosen not to hoard wealth, but to give it away in thoughtful measures. Where they had whispered that I was hiding money, it was now revealed that I had placed it where no one could corrupt it, not even family with sharp tongues and sharper appetites. The contrast was too bright to ignore. A mother giving, a son demanding. People talked, neighbors whispered, and soon even Michael's business partners began to distance themselves, quietly withdrawing support from a man whose greed had been dragged into the light. I heard through a mutual friend that Vanessa was furious, pacing their kitchen like a caged animal, her voice rising as she accused Michael of mishandling everything, of letting it slip into public view, of failing to control the story. She had built her life on appearances, on perfect dinners and curated photographs, and now the same community she sought to impress looked at her with thinly veiled contempt, the kind reserved for people who show their hunger too plainly. Michael, caught between her wrath and his own shame, grew quieter, his calls to me fewer, his words clipped, until one afternoon he left a voicemail that said only, "I don't know how you did this, Mom," his voice low and defeated, as though he still believed it was all some trick, rather than the truth of discipline and intention he had never cared to learn. For me, the days became strangely lighter, not because the hurt was gone. It still pierced me each time I remembered that my own son had tried to strip me of my dignity, but because the truth had a way of burning away the lies. The world now saw not the story Vanessa had scripted, but the reality of what Alan and I had worked for all our lives, and I walked down the street with my head high, greeted not with suspicion but with warmth, neighbors stopping to shake my hand, to tell me they were proud, to remind me that goodness, once revealed, is stronger than any whisper of greed. And though I had not sought the spotlight, I realized that in exposing themselves, Michael and Vanessa had handed me the greatest victory of all, the chance to reclaim my story in front of everyone, unbroken, unashamed, and stronger than they had ever believed I could be. The weeks that followed the courtroom and the headlines unfolded like a slow collapse, the kind of unraveling that doesn't roar but hisses quietly as seams split one by one. And though I had no desire to linger near Michael and Vanessa's turmoil, word of their downfall reached me in fragments, carried on the lips of neighbors, whispered in the aisles of the grocery store, even murmured at church, as if the whole community was now holding a mirror up to them. Michael's business, once held together by fragile trust, began to crack almost immediately. Partners who had smiled beside him at luncheons and posed for photographs at ribbon cuttings suddenly remembered urgent reasons to withdraw. Deals that had been whispered, as certain turned to dust overnight, and the phone calls he had once answered with confidence grew shorter, colder, until they stopped altogether. Vanessa, who had always carried herself like a queen surveying her court, now found her invitations dwindling, her carefully curated circle of friends no longer eager to sip wine in her living room, their smiles turning stiff, their conversations clipped, as though association with her greed might stain them too. I heard from Grace, my neighbor, that Vanessa had been seen leaving a cafe in tears after a sharp exchange with a former friend who told her plainly that generosity earns respect, while grasping hands only draw pity. It was the kind of humiliation Vanessa could not endure, and soon her bitterness turned inward, directed not at herself but at Michael, her voice raised behind their closed doors, blaming him for the failure, accusing him of weakness, of letting me outmaneuver them. Chloe, poor child, confided in me one afternoon as we sat on the porch with mugs of cocoa, her small hands cupped around the warmth, her eyes downcast as she whispered that the house was full of shouting now, that her mother and father barely spoke except to hurl blame, that silence had become as heavy as thunder, pressing on her until she fled to her room with music in her ears. I listened with my heart breaking, stroking her hair, telling her that storms inside a house can feel the loudest of all, but that she was not the cause of it, nor would she ever be. I promised her again, as I always did, that she had a place with me where the air was calm, where love did not demand conditions or accounts. Meanwhile, Vanessa's bitterness sharpened into action, and whispers reached me that she had quietly consulted a divorce attorney, her voice carrying venom as she declared to anyone who would listen that Michael had failed her, that he had chosen weakness over strength, that he had cost her not only money but the image she cherished more than love itself. Michael, stripped of both reputation and support, looked increasingly lost, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn, as though he was beginning to understand too late that he had traded his mother's trust for nothing but ashes. And me, I watched all of this from a distance, my heart torn between sorrow and a cold steadiness, because though it hurt deeply to see my own child falter, to see him swallowed by the consequences of choices I had begged him not to make, I also knew that this was not my storm to calm anymore. I had spent a lifetime building, guarding, giving, and if Michael chose to burn his bridges in pursuit of greed, then he had to walk through the smoke on his own. In the quiet of my home, with Chloe's laughter still echoing faintly from her last visit, I lit another cedar candle and told myself that dignity had been preserved, truth had been revealed, and the rest, however painful, was no longer mine to carry. In the quiet weeks after Vanessa finally packed her things and left Michael standing in the wreckage of a life he had built on sand, I found myself sitting at my old oak desk one evening, the house filled with the scent of lilacs drifting through the window, a pen poised in my hand as I reviewed documents that would close this chapter once and for all. Richard sat across from me, his glasses perched low, as he read line by line, nodding slowly, his steady voice confirming what I already knew, that with a single signature, the future of what I had built could be sealed beyond the reach of those who had tried to take it by force. The trust was already established, the scholarships and grants already in motion, but there remained one piece unspoken, a small account Alan and I had nurtured quietly, never mentioned, never touched, meant only for a day when it might matter most. I thought of Michael, my son, the boy who once begged me to hold his hand crossing the street, the man who now could barely look me in the eye without shame. He had called once since Vanessa's departure, his voice low and broken, not with apology but with regret, and even then it was not regret for what he had done to me, but for what he had lost. I listened, my heart aching, but when he asked if there was any way to repair the damage, to be part of what was left, I knew in my bones that he was not asking to rebuild love. He was asking if there was still money to be had, and in that moment, as painful as it was, I understood that nothing I gave him would ever fill the emptiness he carried, and that giving again would only feed the hunger that had already destroyed him. So I turned my thoughts to Chloe, the granddaughter who had been my light through the darkest days, the child who sat beside me with cocoa in her hands and asked questions too heavy for her years, yet still met the world with kindness instead of bitterness. I saw her laughter, her curiosity, her unguarded love, and I knew without hesitation that if anyone deserved the legacy Alan and I had built, it was her. And so, with my pen pressed firmly against the paper, I signed my name to the final document that transferred every last piece of that hidden account into a trust marked for Chloe alone, untouchable by her parents, untouchable by greed, waiting for her to step into adulthood, with the kind of foundation that would let her build, dream, and give without fear. When Richard closed the folder and slid it gently toward me, I felt an immense stillness settle over the room, a peace I had not known in months. Outside, the rain that had so often accompanied these battles was absent, replaced by a calm twilight, the sky painted in soft golds and pinks as though the world itself wanted to mark the ending. I leaned back in my chair and whispered Alan's name, telling him that we had done it, that our sacrifices had not been wasted, that our love had outlasted betrayal, and though no one else heard, I felt him there, steady and proud, just as he had always been. Michael never knew about that last account, and he never will. To him I remained a woman who withheld, who chose principle over pity, but to me I was simply keeping my promise, to honor the life we built, to protect what mattered, to ensure that the next generation would carry not the scars of greed, but the gift of security and dignity. Chloe will inherit not just money, but the story behind it, the story of patience, discipline, and the quiet revenge of a woman who refused to be broken. And as I blew out the candle on my desk, the room sinking into a soft darkness, I smiled to myself, not with triumph, not with cruelty, but with the calm certainty of justice finally served, because everyone who deserved consequences had faced them, everyone who tried to take by force had been left empty-handed, and the only one who had given love freely would one day receive more than she ever expected. That, I thought, is how true revenge looks, not loud, not bitter, but quiet, steady, and utterly complete. And now I really want to hear what you think, because stories like mine carry so many echoes in other families too. So tell me in the comments what part of this story hit you the hardest, and what would you have done in my place? Don't forget to hit that like button if you stayed with me till the end, and make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the next story, because trust me, there are plenty more twists and turns coming your way. Your support means more than you know. Every comment, every like, every subscription keeps this little community alive and growing, and I'm so grateful to share these moments with you.